Remembering Survival, inside a Nazi slave labor camp, by Christopher Browning, narrated by Carter Banks. Chapter 15, Jewish Work. The actual place of Jewish work in Nazi ideology and policy has been a matter of dispute. Seizing on the phrase destruction through labor, or Vernichtung durch Arbeit, some have portrayed Jewish work as merely instrumental to the Nazi ideological goal of extermination. In one such mutilation, Jewish work was not only a method for the destruction of Jewish life, but also an additional means for the gratuitous torment of Jewish victims and the gratification of German perpetrators through the systematic infliction of economically wasteful suffering. The purpose of Jewish work was punishment, torture, and debilitation, not economic production. Others have dismissed Nazi ideology as propaganda or rhetoric and characterized the Nazi persecution and mass murder of the Jews as the byproduct of economically motivated and calculated decisions and priorities. The position for which I am arguing, and which is joined by several other historians who have recently published on the subject, is that the German use of Jewish slave labor was not a matter of consensus and varied so much according to the time and place that no single phrase, such as destruction through labor, can capture some presumed consistency and essence of Nazi policy. Thus, even during the period of systematic extermination, which ideological goals enjoyed their greatest priority over utilitarian considerations, there always were exceptions. Indeed, one justification for a case study like this, one of a single complex of factory slave labor camps, is that it can provide a detailed look at one historically demonstrated variant of the productive use of slave labor, Jewish slave labor, within the parameters set by an ideologically driven policy of extermination. Jewish work in the Strachowitz camps can be divided into two basic categories: primary work for factory production of munitions and ancillary work for camp maintenance. Work in the factories was, of course, the very reason for the existence of the camps in the first place. Factory production, in turn, had two components: the blast furnace and smelter in the lower factory in the Kamiana River Valley for the production of steel, and the higher-up munitions factory near the Bugaj forest for the manufacture of shell and grenade casings. These products were then packed in wooden crates produced by the workers at Tartak. The explosives for the munitions were produced in the factories in nearby Skarzyko Kamiena. The Radom district was home to additional munition productions sites in Radom, Kielce, Ostrowiec, Radomsko, and Czechoslovakia, as well as Strachowitz and Skarzyko Kamiena. On June 30th, 1943, the Radom district munitions plants employed more than 52,000 workers, of whom more than 14,000 were Jewish slave laborers. In Strachowitz, 1,239 Jewish workers, not including those at Tartak, constituted nearly 10% of a total factory workforce of 12,449. Since the Jewish workers did not have the same high degree of absenteeism that characterized the Polish workers, they were responsible for an even higher percentage of production, and by spring of 1944, The production of ammunition in the Radom district provided 1/3 of the needs of the German infantry. Jewish work here was clearly not contrived as a gratuitous means of the torment, but rather was an essential contribution to the German war effort. This, in turn, explains why even Himmler could not extend his murderous and maniacal campaign of systematic Jewish labor camp liquidation into the Radom district after the Ernstfest operation had been completed in the neighboring Lublin district. It also explains why, in this particular case, the Jewish strategy of survival through labor was not merely illusory. If military and economic exigency preserved the existence of the Jewish slave laborers in the Strachowitze, it also provided the spur for the hyper-intensive exploitation of that labor. Work was organized into both 3 8-hour and 2 12-hour shifts, depending on how strenuous the jobs were. Added to these 8 and 12-hour workdays, of course, was the time needed for the march from the camp to the factories and back. The most physically difficult jobs were of 3 kinds. First, those that involved working in tremendous heat, in very close proximity to the factory furnaces. Second, those that involved hard lifting, such as loading and pushing carts of coal or scrap metal to the smelter, or stacking heavy shells. And third, those that involved working with the acid baths for newly produced casings. Jobs that were somewhat less physically taxing were highly desired. Assigned to a controller's job, one survivor remarked that, relative to others, "I had it good." Another survivor hurt his hand in an industrial accident, but had the good fortune to be working for a foreman who had been a pre-war customer in his mother's shop, so the manager reassigned him to the warehouse. There he was able to set up a smuggling business, so that I was living pretty well. The pace of work was set by very high quotas that had to be met, and factory foremen imposed such quotas brutally to pressure Jewish workers for higher productivity. Years later, many survivors could still remember precisely the daunting quotas they raced to meet. For instance, when Jewish women replaced Polish women in the section producing bomb fuses, the daily quota was immediately doubled from 250 to 500. The sanctions for not meeting quotas were compelling: being kept at work through the following shift, beating, or even accusation of sabotage. The ultimate sanction, of course, was the danger of being listed as arbeitsunfähig, or incapable of work, with lethal consequences if a selection were held. The job assignment directly affected each slave laborer's quality of life, in camp and ultimate fate. The same people who staffed the Jewish labor division within the German Labor Office in Strachowitze, Isaac Lachs and his daughter, Chunka, kept the index card files of workers in Majauka and Stralnica, respectively. They received instructions from the camp council, which in turn relayed from the German factory managers the number of workers that needed to be allotted to various tasks each day. At least several survivors were convinced that they had received especially difficult work assignments for being in the bad graces of the camp council or the camp police. The work experienced was shaped not only by the job assigned, but also by the nature of the Polish foreman and German supervisor to whom one was assigned. Some Polish foremen took advantage of their position to abuse Jewish workers. Others were strict but non-vicious. At least one had the reputation of screaming and kicking when there was a German present, but otherwise was not harsh. Some were simply extortionate and corrupt. They tormented their Jewish workers until they were given gifts or payments, and then provided easier jobs for those who paid up. For instance, Chaim Flachenbaum gave his Polish foreman cigarettes and vodka and was then assigned indoor rather than outdoor work in the middle of winter. Some Jewish workers remembered significant differences among their Polish supervisors. Leo Bach, who worked at the physically taxing job of pushing carts of ore to the smelter, said that the weight masters were good Polish individuals who, out of sympathy for us, overlooked incorrect loads, but two of the Polish supervisors went out of their way to make life miserable for their Jewish workers. Among the German supervisors, von Schwarzer, who was in charge of blast furnace, was cruel and notorious for making his Jewish laborers work double shifts. In contrast, Temple in the Shell division was deemed very decent. Willy Frania at the New Press had a reputation as proper and decent, but the most preferred German supervisor was Bruno Pape at the Small Forge. He treated his 120 Jewish workers decently and even allowed the establishment of a separate eating room, a so-called Judenstube, where they did not have to wait until Polish workers were finished eating to get whatever was left. He pronounced separate eating space for his Jewish workers as being in line with our ideology. He also allowed the baking of matzos there. He permitted his Jewish interpreter, Joseph Friedenson, to arrange for more workers than were needed, including women, but especially those who were endangered and needed a place safe from mistreatment and harassment. When Kolditz insisted that Simcha Minkberg, the former head of the Judenrat, work at the factory, the camp council placed him with Pape. The same arrangement was made for some older Talmudic scholars who arrived in the camp with the Krakow transport. There was, in short, a different atmosphere in Pape's small forge than elsewhere in the factories. Since factory production of munitions was the labor camp's reason for being, the vast majority of inmates clearly worked for that purpose. But the existence of the camps, in turn, created the need for camp maintenance and thus required a number of internal jobs as well. Many of these, the camp council, camp police, and barracks supervisors, Blockosten, were held by members of the camp's male elite. Jews who supervised other Jews through the camp administration were spared factory labor. But there were also two other types of internal camp jobs. One kind was for providing special services to the Germans. Most important in this regard were the skilled artisans and craftsmen, such as tailors and shoemakers. Even before the liquidation of the Wiersbennik ghetto, the Germans had confiscated some items such as sewing machines and had set up a workshop of skilled craftsmen known as the Konsum. It was supervised by a man named Otto von Ribbeck, who was considered not bad. Of his two assistants, Neumann and Wunderlich, however, the latter was very feared for the frequent use of his ox whip. When the ghetto was liquidated, the skilled craftsmen were moved into their own barracks in Mazałka, some accompanied by their wives and children. They had their own kitchen, received more food, and were dressed like humans rather than in rags. The craftsmen of the Konsum produced uniforms, boots, and other such items highly desired by the Germans. Several entrepreneurial women who engaged in dressmaking for the Germans on the side were given non-demanding cover jobs as well. One man found himself occupying a special niche as a personal barber to Kolditz and the Ukrainian guards. The camp council was instructed to provide him with decent clothing once he had been assigned this job. The other internal jobs in the camp kitchen and camp laundry were held more frequently, though not exclusively, by women. Assignment to these coveted jobs was usually obtained in one of four ways. One was through connections. The relatives of the camp elite often had positions in the kitchen. Another was through payment. Nacha Baum was a short and skinny girl, sentenced girl of 17, before her parents were taken away. Her father not only procured her a work card, but also arranged for her to have a job peeling potatoes in the camp kitchen. After 6 months with no further help from her parents, she lost that job and was sent off to heavy labor. Rachela Sachers and her mother soon found the factory work dangerously exhausting. Rachela's younger sister subsequently wrote, "Father was able to arrange through Shloim Einesman, now a member of the Judenrat, for mother and Rachela to work in the camp laundry. Favors such as these were by no means had for the asking. While it is true that father and Shloim Einesman were boyhood friends and that Shloim may have been more inclined to extend a favor to father than to other Jews, even without payment, special treatment was gained for a price. Lapauka, bribery, was a byword, a way of life in camp. Father paid off Einesman handsomely for the countless acts of intervention on behalf of our family, though not necessarily for each one. In addition to connections and payment, however, sometimes people seem to have been assigned to the kitchen and laundry simply out of mercy. Mirjam and Halina Zeilbergberg, two teenage sisters from Pluk, found themselves alone in Strelnica when their father, working the night shift, was sent to Mazhauka and the rest of the family was deported to Treblinka. Without any connections or financial means, they were nonetheless given jobs in the kitchen and laundry, respectively. A weakening Salek Benedict, on a doctor's recommendation, was allowed to work for 1 week in the kitchen, where he could regain a little strength by working less and eating more. And finally, some worked in the kitchen or laundry on overtime, peeling potatoes and washing clothes for others who had the means to hire them as substitutes. Jewish work at Strachowitz was a serious matter of economic utility and military exigency to the Germans. For the Jewish slave laborers, it was a matter of life and death, both in justifying their continuing existence in spite of the German goal of total extermination and in affecting if and how they survived the conditions under which they were enslaved. This latter issue of surviving camp conditions was closely related not only to work, but also to two other key factors, namely food and the camp's underground economy. And that concludes Chapter 15